9. German submarine U-534. The type IX C-40 U-534, or U-534 for short, was a long-range German submarine that served in their navy from 1942 to 1945. Its main purpose was to destroy all enemies of the Third Reich that it came across. The sub was also used for testing military weapons, while also functioning as a weather ship in the North Atlantic. The vessel returned to Germany in late 1944, where it was laid up in the port city of Kiel. By the time the Germans had surrendered to the Allied forces on May 4, 1945, the U-534 had already left port again. A British Royal Air Force bomber sank it just one day later near the Danish island of Anholt. All 52 people on the sub managed to escape, and 49 of them survived the ordeal and were rescued. Experts have long since wondered where the submarine was headed when it got shot down, especially since it left port right around the time that the Germans initially surrendered. There was an Argentinian woman aboard, suggesting that the vessel may have been trying to get to South America. But no one will ever know for sure, since only the submarine's captain knew where it was truly going, and he took that secret to his grave. A Danish wreck diver named Arge Jensen rediscovered the U-534 in 1986 after rumors of a Nazi treasure on board started circulating. The ship was raised, and although it turned out to hold nothing of monetary worth, it offered a historically valuable glimpse back in time. 8. Cold War relics in the Caribbean. Outside of Cuba, it's extremely rare to find Cold War relics in the Caribbean region. One unique exception to this is the former Pearls Airport located along Grenada's northeastern coast. It functions today primarily as grazing land for nearby farm animals. Established in 1943, it was the country's first ever airport. During World War II, the Allies used the site for military aircraft. After the war, it was reverted back for civilian use, primarily serving under the name Leeward Islands Air Transport (LIAT), which transported people to and from other Caribbean islands. There was no major military activity at Pearls again until 1983, when US Marines captured the airport during the Americans' invasion of Grenada. In a mission codenamed Operation Urgent Fury, American troops took over the island within days with reinforcements from 6 Caribbean nations. The US invaded Grenada during the construction of the Morris Bishop International Airport, which was being built with the help from Cuba and the Soviet Union. These alleged communist connections are what first compelled the Americans to storm the coast. Supplies for the new airport were ferried into the country from Cuba to Pearls, where many abandoned aircraft from that time remain to this day. The property is home to an old Cubana Airlines plane and a Soviet crop duster, which were damaged during the invasion. Visitors can walk right onto the site and explore the aircraft if they're brave, but are told to be mindful of the cow and goat waste they're likely to spot on the property where livestock tend to roam. The former airport is also a touchy topic for some locals since it stirs up memories of the invasion, which left some deep emotional wounds, and tourists are asked to be respectful considering those sensitivities. 7. The Bismarck. Built during the late 1930s, the Bismarck was the most formidable warship in Europe for a brief period. Its short-lived glory ended though when it sank just 8 days into its maiden voyage. During the first few days of the mission to intercept Allied cargo ships carrying supplies to Britain, the vessel sank the legendary British flagship known as the HMS Hood. The English were infuriated by this and sent the British Atlantic Navy after the Bismarck, with instructions to attack with full force. An all-out battle then began, and the British won while the Bismarck sank deep down to the ocean floor. It remained missing until 1989, when Robert Ballard, the same oceanographer who famously discovered the Titanic shipwreck, located the Bismarck's remains. The sunken ship was in shockingly pristine condition, with the swastikas that were painted on it shortly after its construction still clearly visible. What's even more surprising is the fact that the vessel was still largely intact even after landing on top of an underwater volcano and tumbling 2/3 of the way down the 3,300-foot slope. The hull was still intact, indicating that the Bismarck had completely flooded before it sank to this point. Otherwise, the hull would have imploded from the immense pressure of the surrounding water. Would you ever deep-sea dive to a shipwreck? Tell us in the comments and hit subscribe while you're at it. 6. HMS Pandora. Launched in 1779, the British Royal Navy ship HMS Pandora went down in history for capturing 14 mutineers in the South Pacific conflict, who'd taken control of another Royal Navy vessel called the HMS Bounty. Shortly into its return voyage to Britain back in 1791, the Pandora ran aground on the outer reaches of the Great Barrier Reef. It sank the next morning, killing 31 crew members and 4 of the Bounty mutineers that were on board. Colonial officials in New South Wales, Australia didn't even try to salvage the wreck. Because of this, it became lost to history until 1977, when a trio of explorers found the sunken ship. The Pandora quickly became famous as one of the most significant wrecks in all of the Southern Hemisphere. Archaeologists from the Queensland Museum carried out several excavations at the site between 1983 and 1999. The team found skeletal remains for several crew members along with fancy shoe buckles, buttons, wax seals, and a one-of-a-kind 18th century stamp that belonged to the ship's first lieutenant, John Larkin. They managed to dig up a portion of the wreck, but much of the vessel remains buried underneath what the marine archaeologist Peter Gesner described as a marine Pompeii. Raising the Pandora would be a time-consuming and extremely expensive task. The price of recovering the copper-sheathed hull alone was estimated around $60 million in 1998, and it would undoubtedly cost much more now. So, it's unlikely the wreck will ever be brought to the surface, and it's unknown whether there are plans to continue excavating and exploring it. 5. Iraqi Air Force jets. While searching for the Al-Taqadum airfield west of Baghdad back in 2003, US military teams found dozens of buried Iraqi Air Force fighter jets. The shocking discovery was first made when one team member saw the tail fins of a Cold War-era aircraft barely sticking up out of the sand. It was easy to see that the planes were still fully intact at the time that they were buried, but nothing could be done to protect them. Several other planes were found beneath trees, draped by camouflage sheets. To further hide them, the Iraqi military had scattered the airfield with planes that had already been destroyed in previous wars, making it difficult for bombers to choose which targets were worth aiming for. Before the Iraq War, intelligence experts estimated that the Iraqi military had about 300 combat aircraft left over from the Kuwait War of 1991. But the country's air force was noticeably absent at the beginning of the Iraq War in 2003, leading US military officials to suspect the fighter jets were not being used since they were deemed inadequate against the formidable air power of America and Britain. The search team was looking for weapons of mass destruction when it came across the planes, which are obviously a lot less dangerous. But as Congressman Portagos pointed out, they're still weapons that Iraq lied about and tried to hide. 4. HMS Bronington. The British minesweeper known as the HMS Bronington was built during the 1950s. When the ship first launched in 1953, the British Royal Navy was undergoing a modernization scheme, mainly by switching to the use of metal and synthetic materials. The Bronington was one of the last vessels of its kind ever built, with a trademark mahogany hull that British wooden-hulled naval ships were well known for. It was one of the 119 ton-class vessels that were built in the 1950s for the British Navy, some of which were also used by South Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Argentina, and more. As part of his service in the Royal Navy, Prince Charles commanded the Bronington from February until December 1976. He was a well-liked skipper, but the 10-month stint really wore him out. At the end of his service, Charles left the ship in a wheelchair. In 1989, the Bronington Trust bought the decommissioned vessel in hopes of saving it. It was tied down in Manchester for several more years before being acquired by the Warship Preservation Trust in 2002. It was then relocated, but its owners went into liquidation during 2008, bringing any future plans for the Bronington to a screeching halt. Nature soon took over from there. Before long, there was a tree growing on the ship as it started to sink. The Bronington sank in 2016. At one point, there were plans to raise the vessel up, but like all the other plans people have had for it over the years, it never actually happened. The ship started sinking in place and remains partially submerged to this day. For a few years, efforts were made to pump water out of the ship, but that also stopped happening. Not everyone has given up on Bronington though. Speaking with The News, former Navy engineer Mike McBride said he believed the ship could be saved if someone would just finance the project. While the possibility has not been completely ruled out, it seems unlikely that someone will fund the endeavor, especially taxpayers. 3. Focke-Wulf 190 Graveyard. More than 70 years ago, after the end of World War II, the US reportedly asked the Turkish government to bury over 50 German-made Focke-Wulf 190 fighter aircraft. The decommissioned planes were then allegedly buried in the central city of Kayseri at a now-defunct airport that now functions as a military headquarters. But some aviation experts claim this never really happened and that most of the vehicles were sold as scrap. Turkey acquired the planes at a time when it was trying to delicately manage relationships with both Allied and Axis powers without taking anyone's side. In exchange for the aircraft, the country sold oil and chrome to Germany. Whether the planes were buried or destroyed, they still disappeared one way or another, according to the terms of a secret agreement with the United States government. In 2015, researchers finally got permission from the Turkish to excavate the site where they believed the planes were buried. But they ran into some bureaucratic red tape, so the dig has been placed on hold ever since. Experts continue to hope for a chance to search for the legendary buried Focke-Wulfs, which could still be flyable if the stories prove to be true. 2. HMS Plymouth. Back in 1982, Britain and Argentina went head-to-head in a 10-week-long territorial conflict referred to as the Falklands War. One of the most important vessels the British military had at the time was a ship named the HMS Plymouth. Soldiers used this vessel to launch helicopters and bombs at the Argentine forces, and their enemy struck back. At one point, a bomb struck the Plymouth's deck, causing severe damage to the ship. A fire then broke out, but the crew managed to put it out quickly, so thankfully nobody was seriously hurt from the ordeal. After the war, the Plymouth returned to the UK and was repaired and put on display on the River Clyde in Glasgow, Scotland. But nobody seemed to have taken care of the ship after this, so it fell into further disrepair. The Plymouth was left deteriorating for years before getting transported to Turkey, where it was demolished in 2014. Locals had fought to save and restore the ship, but it never happened. 1. The Maid of Harlech. One day in 2007, a family of beachgoers spotted a partially buried World War II American fighter plane sticking out from the sand along a shoreline in northern Wales. Nicknamed the Maid of Harlech, it was the long-forgotten Lockheed P-38 Lightning's third appearance in over 65 years. 24-year-old Second Lieutenant Robert F. Elliott was flying the plane when it crash-landed on September 27, 1942. He tried an emergency landing when the left engine lost power a little less than an hour into the flight, but then the right engine also malfunctioned. The plane landed in 2 feet of water. Elliott survived, but investigators accused him of being too careless and blamed him for the crash. Luckily for him, the UK's beaches were closed to the public for obvious safety reasons at the time, so the case received little, if any, publicity. In fact, the press was banned from talking about Allied disasters, and the wreck was kept under extremely tight wraps. There's no evidence that any beach visitors saw the wreck after the shores reopened, and authorities have always kept its location quiet to prevent people from interfering with it. The aircraft's guns have since been removed, but it still carries its fuel load. The Maid of Harlech wasn't seen again until the 1970s, when it was partially uncovered from 6.5 feet of sand. It appeared once more in 2007 and in 2014. If you're hoping to catch a first-hand glimpse of this World War II relic, good luck even finding it. You would need perfect timing considering shifting sands and waters, and its location has remained a closely guarded secret. During the Maid of Harlech's most recent 120-day appearance, local aviation historian Matt Rimmer remained on guard to make sure nobody interfered with it. Thanks for watching. Which one of these mysterious abandoned war machines shocked you the most? Tell us in the comments below and don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. Bye.